That's a true story. Hypatia was the daughter of the mathematician who ran the Library of Alexandria at that time, and it was destroyed by the Christians, as far as we know. That movie, by the way, was made right about the time that President Bush was trying to get all the allies together to go to war against Iraq. And it was pretty obviously political. What they were basically doing was showing that back in that time, the Christians were like the Islamists today, right? Destroying all the culture, etc., right? You know, not trusting the books, right? But there is a point actually where St. Augustine in the Confessions talks about reading the philosophy books and the other literature and pointing out that Christians have destroyed the works that are not worthy of being kept as good Christians, etc., right? So you get the idea that Christianity is not completely wonderful for everybody because they are doing away with the pagans, right? And in the movie Agora, you could see that the pagans are the ones. It's the library is not just a library; it's also a pagan temple, and the Christians under Saint Cyril, that was the bishop who led the Christians at that time to overthrow the pagans, overthrow the government. By the way, Saint Cyril was made a saint, obviously, which is like an honorary, award, basically, by the church for his efforts in establishing Christianity as the religion of the day in Alexandria, Egypt. And it's really kind of a personal thing for me because when I grew up, I was enrolled in a grammar school in East Lansdowne that was St. Cyril of Alexandria. So I grew up and studied in a school for 8 years and then went on to Monsignor Bonner High School, which was run by Augustinians, by the way, the Order of St. Augustine. But so, of course, I grew up thinking St. Cyril was a great bishop, and then as a young person, I learned about what he basically did to Hypatia, and he let the people basically capture her and skin her alive and leave her to die in the sun in the streets. So I'm not that hot on St. Cyril anymore. I kind of lost my attachment. However, Ambrose is absolutely fascinating. In fact, let me show you something. I had some really good ones, but one of them was. Well, I'll just play this one. Turn it down so you don't throw things at me. But in the Confessions, when Augustine's mother died, one of the things that helped cheer him up was that the church chanted her favorite Ambrosian chant. It's called Ambrosian because Ambrose wrote it, Bishop Ambrose. So his chants are referred to as the Ambrosian chant. When you look at other church chants from a later period, they're usually called Gregorian chant, which actually musically a little more sophisticated. So there's a constant growth in the sophistication of the church music. the idea, I guess. Let me get back, though, to my notes. So, I mentioned that Augustine is a Platonist, philosophically. By the way, he is familiar with Aristotle. And if you look at the Confessions again, at one point where he's a young man and studying and reading Greek plays and things, Cicero is one of the ones who really impresses him. He reads a dialogue by Cicero called Hortensius, but the play or the dialogue of Hortensius is missing. We have a few scraps from it, but they don't have it anymore. But he describes it as persuading him to really love philosophy. So that's kind of interesting. But he also reads Aristotle's Metaphysics. He calls it the predicaments, which is odd. But when you look at him going through the predicaments and describing the various characteristics they have, what you discover, of course, is that he's going through this, the category of the substance, the quantity-quality relationships, and so on. So he's basically doing that short section of the metaphysics that we talked about briefly when we were looking at Aristotle's Metaphysics. And it is interesting to think of it as the predicaments. Let me show you the... PDF, so this is bound to be tedious. I shouldn't have clicked on it, but okay. So basically, we know that Aristotle's also read at least the Metaphysics of Aristotle, but nonetheless, he's a Platonist for the most part. So that's kind of intriguing. That would be a whole interesting opportunity there for someone to get a PhD if you want to try to figure out why Augustine would be familiar with the metaphysics of Aristotle and yet still have been a Platonist, because the metaphysics is where he explains what's wrong with Plato. So that's kind of interesting, I would think. But he merges Christian beliefs with a Neoplatonist philosophy. So God, instead of being good, God is love. I'm not sure if what you're familiar with from Christianity, especially if you've been tortured or had Christian armies attacking you as part of a crusade, but the interesting argument is that the main message that Jesus brings is love your neighbor as yourself, etc. Right? And there's good grounds for arguing that. When you look at like the Jesus Seminar, which is about 700 different scholars who all study Jesus and the church history and so on. And they come together every 4 years in a conference, and they write articles jointly, some of them, and so on. They pretty much all agree that the main thing that Jesus could that we could look to is that he was teaching a philosophy of love. Right? So God is love. And of course, Augustine is going to really set that tone. Another interesting thing is the question of evil. And this is a problem that Plato has an issue with too, because for Plato, everything that's created is created by the good, and the good obviously should be good, so how come there's evil in the world? Augustine deals with that by basically arguing that evil doesn't exist. And this gets into the fall. You're familiar, of course, with Adam and Eve are in the garden, and God has said, you can eat of everything except this particular tree, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat of that tree, because if you do, you will die and suffer and have to watch commercials on YouTube, because you're not paying for YouTube, right? Sorry, I don't know where that. Maybe that wasn't in the Bible. I don't know where that came from. I think Abraham Lincoln was right. You can't trust everything you read on the internet. But in the fall, Adam and Eve are, of course, there, and they do apparently eat the fruit. I don't know if they really did. In fact, did I tell you about my favorite explanation of what happened in the Garden of Eden? It's a really neat book if you get the chance. It was found by a guy named Mark Twain, and it's Eve's diary. So we actually have Eve's diary. As you can see, she even has a nice cover. There's she and her husband with the snake, notice? And it's amazing how hair and snakes just kind of cover up the important thing. Oops, well, but there you see. So this is Eve's actual diary that she wrote, right? Saturday, I am almost a whole day old now. I arrived yesterday, right? That is as it seems to me. And it must be so, for if there was a day before yesterday, I was not there when it happened, etc., and so on. So pretty interesting. She's an experiment, she says. Then if I am an experiment, am I the whole of it? No, I think not. I think the rest of it is part of it, etc. Everything looks better today than it did yesterday. In the rush of finishing up yesterday, the mountains were left in a ragged condition, and some of the plains were so cluttered with rubbish. And it's right because it's world construction, etc. There's no telling where it went to, etc. What is she talking about here? I think this is. Get it back again. I wish we had 5 or 6. Well, she does get around to talking. She's puzzled about the teeth of the carnivores because they're obviously not ripe for eating fruits and vegetables. She's puzzled over why they have those kinds of teeth, and so on. But she also talks about this guy who keeps trying to run away from her. At last I was a good deal worried and climbed a tree. I waited a good while, then gave it up and went home. Today the same thing over. I got it up the tree again. Adam, he's constantly scared of her. He doesn't know what to make of her. So this is hilarious if you get the chance. And notice the whole book is there for you. So she finally gets, all the week I tagged around after him and tried to get acquainted. I had to do the talking because he was shy, but I didn't mind it. He seemed pleased to have me around, and I used the sociable we a good deal because it seemed to flatter him to be included, etc. By the way, there's also the Adams Family Papers, and in that you get to see Adam's point of view. And he describes all of these interactions as totally different than what Eve is getting out of it. So that's just one of my favorites. But from Augustine, and this is like the official source of this interpretation, that what happens in the garden is that, yes, Adam and Eve eat the fruit, and God comes into the garden and they hide, which is weird. Why would they hide? Obviously God knows, right? And God says, "Where are you?" Right? And obviously he's God, so he actually knows where they are. So Augustine says the reason he says, "Where are you?" is not because he doesn't know where they are. It's because we don't know ourselves where we are. We don't know what we've done to ourselves, Adam and Eve, having eaten the fruit. And they basically don't want to admit to what they've done, right? And Adam is the worst of it because he blames it on the woman. She gave me the fruit, and she's the one you gave me. Right? So, hey, not my fault I broke the rules, right? But of course, that's dishonest in itself, right? We're not living up to our own self-recognition of what we have done. But as a result of this, theoretically now, we know good and evil. And it's kind of interesting. This is a similar story if you've ever heard of Pandora's box, right? You know, Pandora means all of the gifts, right? So if you know, Pandora opens all the gifts, and out of the box comes good and evil. So if you're going to get good, you're going to get evil with it. They go together. Now here's the interesting aspect of this. God hasn't created evil, Augustine says. Evil is not. It's a lack of stuff, right? What God has created, everything God has created is good. This is Plato, right? So everything God has created is good. With Plato, you get the sense that matter, because of its fluctuation and constant kind of not staying still, right, is what causes corruption and evil, right? But with Augustine, God creates only good. So even the matter that has been created is good. Nature is beautiful. But what brings good and evil into the world is our knowledge of it. So by eating that fruit now, we know we like this and we don't like this. We like this and we don't like this. And we like, etc., right? And so it's not, the tree, is the tree good or evil? No, the tree is a tree, right? And it's a good tree, right? But I love the tree because it gives us such wonderful shade during the hot summers here. That could be a joke, right? But my neighbor hates the tree because it has all these cotton things all over, and they're allergic to it. And so the neighbors are suffering miserably during the time when the tree is throwing all this cotton all over the place, right? So for them, when are you going to cut down that evil tree, right? And I'm thinking, but it's a beautiful tree, right? So it's good to me, it's evil to them. And that's the way all good and evil things are. They're good and evil from the perspective of the perceiver who likes it or hates it, right? A lot of things, of course, are just, oh, that's a nice table. That's nothing. If it broke, oh, well, we'll get a new one, right? I'm not especially fond of it or not, right? But if I'm really absolutely enamored of something, and then it dies on me, now I'm heartbroken, even though that's just the normal course of nature, right? So if you compare men to animals, animals don't get all upset. Actually, I know elephants will have a funeral for a lost loved one. I've seen that on TV where they're all gathered around and they're touching the one that's dead.
Oh, I can look that up.
Yeah, it's kind. We could find that.
It's okay. I always want to jot stuff down.
Just call it elephant funeral.
Midway is an amazing story.
It's about the man that played such an
One last hurdle lies ahead. The bank is steep and slippery.
How did the camera survive this?
Yeah.
Made it.
How long is this?
What's this 3 minutes?
On the other side, something unexpected. An elephant corpse. Elephant graveyards may be a myth, but death holds a strange fascination for them. The hovering foot seems to be trying to deduce who this was. A lost family member, perhaps. The trunk seeks clues from smell. It's as though they're paying homage to someone they once knew.
Is it a funeral?
Some scientists believe elephants can breathe.
May just
Their
be
actions
curiosity
certainly
versus
suggest
like,
they're deeply moved by what
Yeah. When I think about it, though, I don't imagine that St. Augustine would have thought animals had
as they
the
follow
same kind of
birds.
rituals that humans have. Even early,
It's
in the
difficult to
modern
imagine what's
period,
going on in their minds, but such an
it seems
intimacy
pretty
there
clear that they don't
suggests a
think
recognition
animals have
of their own
souls
existence.
like humans do.
Only a fully conscious being can think in such a way.
But who's going to disagree with the BBC?
Lives. Immediately, our group sets up.
No, I would probably think so because we can communicate. Animals can communicate to each other.
Yeah, well, we know now that elephants have language,
Mhm.
probably have
Dolphins
names
and-
for each other, etc. Well, so evil enters into the world because of our sin, basically. And when you think about it, another aspect of this is the concept of original sin. And what that is basically the idea that every human entering into the world already has original sin. In other words, it's inherited this because of the sin of Adam and Eve, right? And it's kind of an interesting, that means you're already condemned, basically, as an infant. And a lot of people feel that that's absolutely a horrific idea because look at this cute little baby. It's too cute to think that this is a sinner, and condemned unless we quick get it baptized. Some sects, they baptize right away. Others figure you ought to wait until you're an adult. Like Augustine, he gets baptized as a young man. And by the way, one of the things his mother loves about this is baptism wipes away all your sin. So she famously, and he says, sin, save me, Lord, but not right away. Let me sin first, right? You know, I'll get all the sinning out of my system, right? And then I'll be saved and I'll be cleaned, you know, so that I could get into heaven, right?
And run the rain check.
Right. So that's kind of a famous. Let me see if I can find famous.
That was like when I was growing up. My dad's a very strict Seventh-day Adventist. You're not supposed to have jewelry because it's part of the sun god. So, like, when I was little, I had jewelry, but then when my dad reverted to Seventh-day Adventist, I had to take out my jewelry. So, like, my theory when I was a teenager was, I'll have earrings in, and when God comes, I'm just going to rip them out my ears, and I'm no longer a sinner.
See, you got that from Augustine. I don't see that one, but that's, you know. There's a lot of famous.
It's just like kids, you know, they're doing something naughty. As long as you don't catch them, you know,
They're
like,
not being naughty.
not doing nothing naughty.
Yeah.
If you didn't see it, I didn't know how to do it.
Exactly. That's when you hear that whole bunch
But
of.
one of the famous ones is save me, but not right away. You know, give me time to enjoy myself first. Yeah. Okay. So keep this in mind, though. So evil only exists because of our perspective. By the way, a lot of folks absolutely hate this as a possibility because they want to think that say a whole part of our population all dies from the coronavirus, even though a lot of those people don't even drink Coronas. I don't know, but in other words, it's just pure evil that this virus is out there and killing everybody. And if I were to say, it's just natural for all these people to be dying from this virus, and you're only upset and think it's evil because of your own perspective. Just think of it as nature taking its course. People would really be horrified, that I would think that way. That's absolutely horrible. These people are fellow human beings, and they're suffering and dying now because they ate bats or something, in Wuhan. Or actually, I should take it much more seriously. I should fix my recording here.
It's okay.
Makes me sound like I'm making fun of all these.
No.
We've got thousands of people dying now from this. So it's not universally appreciated, his theory of how God can be all good and the creator of everything, and yet at the same time, it appears that there's evil in the world, but it's not because God's created it. It's because we fell by eating the tree of, the fruit, and as a result, we now see the difference between what we like and what we don't like, the good and the evil. That comes into the world through us, and we pass it on to our children. There are no humans that will grow up naturally and just think everything is good, like I suppose animals of different sorts, right? Probably not elephants, but that's one aspect of that. Another issue is free will. If God knows everything, and he knows what we're going to do, including Adam and Eve, he knew that they were going to eat that fruit. He knew it ahead of time, and yet he set them up. So in a sense, his punishing them, and us as a result of it, seems like a nasty thing for an all-good God to do. Why would he take it out on us when it's actually his fault that we came into the world already, right, going to do this, right? Well, how does he answer this? The way I like this is time, and actually we could. I really should take us into the actual text itself while we have the chance here. Let's go into my links here, because one of them so this is an online copy of the link I want to go to book 2. I want to go way down. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So this is a really long. Wow, there's like 30, however many chapters. This is where we are at here. Neither time past nor future.
Works, so,
I think this is the chapter I want here. Yeah, this is the chapter. So let's start off. So, can you see it? So, Lord, since eternity is thine, art thou ignorant of what I say to thee, or dost thou see in time what passeth in time? Why then do I lay in order before thee so many relations, not of a truth that thou mightest learn them through me, but to stir up my own and my readers' devotions toward thee, etc.? God obviously knows all this stuff, so why am I bringing this up? And basically, why, or what does God know about what's already going to happen, right? By the way, each of these chapters is roughly about a page, so he very gradually works as. This is also kind of an interesting thing. The book is a constant dialogue between him and God, where he's asking God things, and that's actually kind of interesting because there's an argument by quite a few people that the modern person doesn't develop until about the modern period. And one person, Harold Bloom, argues that the one who seems most responsible for this is William Shakespeare. And in fact, Harold Bloom argues that there's a very specific point in Shakespeare's plays where this happens, and that's in Hamlet, where Hamlet has that monologue where he's standing in front of the audience and he says, to be or not to be? That is the question, where he's talking to himself about whether or not he should commit suicide or not, right? So basically, Harold Bloom argues this is the point in history where human beings begin thinking to themselves. And that struck me as absolutely ridiculous. You're kidding. What about Augustine? 1,000 years before, practically, right? Well, it turns out that everywhere I've looked, Augustine isn't talking to himself. He's always talking to God. It's almost as if he's got this kind of discourse going on that he seems to not think to himself, if that makes sense. In the same line of reasoning, Pope John Paul II argues that it's René Descartes that comes up with this because of the I think, therefore I am. And so you get this circular self that is thinking about itself and so on. But by the way, René Descartes read Shakespeare. So that's that's kind of interesting. There's another author named Charles Taylor who has a book called The Sources of the Self. Charles Taylor, by the way, is one of the ones I have on my list of philosophers you could do your paper on. But in his book, The Sources of the Self, he gives us like a very gradual history all the way back to Plato with the gradual development of the source of basically we're running a program that we've developed, kind of like, the way Microsoft DOS has changed from DOS 1.0, 2.0, 6.0, etc., right? That in a sense, the way we think about ourself has actually been like a software program that we've been developing over time. And today, of course, the way we think about ourselves, we refer to it as the modern self. We think of it as it's our soul, basically. That's the most important part of us. But it seems that it's a relatively recent development. 400, 500 years. In other words, if we go back to Aristotle might not have thought this way, apparently. We might not see that same thing with Plato. We might not see it with Socrates. We might not see it with Augustine. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So I just throw that in as kind of an intriguing aspect of this. So he's always talking with God as he goes, but what he wants to do here is figure out how time works. And hopefully I have. So we would hear and understand how in the beginning thou madest, and thou is God, right? The heaven and earth. Moses wrote and departed, past, etc. So this is his beginning where he gets in a kind of a tiff with Moses. He gets very upset that Moses encouraged the Hebrews to steal from the Egyptians when they were on their way out. Because that's theft, and theft is a sin. And so he's not very... Remember how upset he was when as a kid he stole the pears, even though he didn't eat the pears, he just did it to be evil. They refer to this as having the will to do evil just in its own is acasia. But by the way, I don't know if no one discusses that anymore. Well, actually, there are people that discuss it. But so, behold, the heavens and earth are; they proclaim they were created, etc. God created them, and so on. But how didst thou make the heaven and the earth? And what the engine of thy so mighty? What is the engine of thy so mighty fabric, etc.? This is fun stuff, actually. But how didst thou speak? God just spoke and let it, and there it is. Well, but how did you speak? In what way did the voice come, etc.? That's fun. Thou callest us then to understand the word of God, etc. I want to get to the good stuff here. even Einstein thinks that Augustine's concept of time is the best. Oh, this is fun. So someone says, you know, what did God do before he made heaven and earth? Have you ever thought that? You know,
I
because God made everything, you know, well, what was God doing before that? Right? He says, I answer not, as one is said to have done merrily, eluding the pressure of the question. He was preparing hell for those who ask such questions, right?
That's interesting.
But he's not really saying that.
Yeah.
But still, that's funny. He obviously is joking here and there.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is, he didn't make anything before he made everything.
Mm-hmm.
Because he made time. Time is part of the universe. So there was no time before the universe was made.
Makes sense.
But if before heaven and earth there was no time, why is it demanded that what thou then didst? For there was no then. What did you do then?
Yeah.
You know, what did you do before you were born?
Oh,
That's a dumb question. There was no,
didn't exist.
you weren't doing anything then, right? Although, obviously, God existed for all eternity,
Mm-hmm.
but what was he doing?
Thank
So
you.
that's, pardon?
Thinking.
I don't know. And he doesn't either, right?
Thinking
By the way,
about
he's
it.
famous for pointing out that he doesn't know the answers to all these questions, right? But at no time then hadst thou not made anything, because time itself thou madest, right? And no times are co-eternal with thee, because thou abidest. But if they abode, they should not be times. For what is time? So here we go. Who can readily and briefly explain this? Who can even in thought comprehend it, so as to utter a word about it? But what in discourse do we mention more familiarly and knowingly than time? And we understand when we speak of it. We understand also when we hear it spoken of by another. What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it to one that asks, I know not. Yet I say boldly that I know that if nothing passed away, time past were not, and if nothing were coming, a time to come were not, and if nothing were, time present were not. Those two times then, past and to come, how are they? Seeing the past now is not, and that to come is not yet. But the present, should it always be present and never pass into time past, verily it should not be time, but eternity. If time present, if it is to be time, only cometh into existence because it passeth into time past, how can we say that either this is, whose cause of being is, that it shall not be? That's, well, you get the idea.
Mm-hmm.
So
Just too many questions.
this is, you know, like, and so how do I look at it? I like drawing a circle, because circles are cool. And I'll put God in the middle, and here's us. We could go this way or this way, either one. But say we're going around this way. This is right now, and then right now, you know, and so time is proceeding, right? And so it looks to us like time is changing constantly, you know, second by second, you know, day by day, etc. And it looks like along with time changing, everything is also changing. The weather's changing, global warming or not, depending on which political side you are, all that kind of thing. So look, and by the way, as we go through this experience, we experience God, and so we might think of God as a plethora of all sorts of powerful beings, like a that's a whole nother thing. Polytheist, thank you. Sorry, polytheist, right? Yeah, if you're into polygamy, that would also result in a whole lot of change constantly too.
Yes.
But a polytheist sees God lots of ways, and gradually our social conception of God changes. We end up with just a few gods, then a single God, and a single God with 3 parts, maybe, and then, and so on. So our experience of God changes. But as a matter of fact, God is present as God completely throughout all time without changing. So the appearance of God changing and the appearance of time changing is the way humans perceive what's going on. But from God's point of view, all of time exists at once.
Just a flash in his eyeballs.
If he has eyes, or she, or it,
It.
right? So God's not changing. God's not learning. God is aware of everything, all that will ever happen all at once. It's our impression that there's this constant interaction because of time. But so when we're looking at time is something that's part of our experience of the universe, not something that God is experiencing as it goes. I mean, when we see stories where, some actor plays God in a movie, mopping the floor
Oh my God.
or whatever, right?
And then Almighty, yeah.
That's what I was
Yeah.
God really doesn't do that. Or if God does, actually, that's just the impression of the people that are having that experience, right? That's not actually God that does that. But God is all time, all at once. And the whole thing is all created at once. And by the way, this is why Einstein likes Augustine. Because I would draw a different diagram for Einstein. This is where we are. But all of time exists at once in Einstein's conception of the theory, of relativity. It's just our impression. Instead of going around a circle here, we're the ones that are always the center of the experienced universe, right, for Einstein. But what's interesting is that really these two are compatible impressions of what, the time exists all at once. So that's kind of impressive. And Einstein actually refers to Augustine as being his favorite conception of time. We do say there's a short time and a long time, etc. We say all of that, but we really don't know what time is. But time is present. This is just really good stuff. A lot of people enjoy this as literature, etc. This whole book is pretty interesting if you get the chance. Okay. But what about, how does this tie into our guilt at the choices we make? Because if God knows everything, God knows that when I get to here, I'm going to run over somebody on Northern Lights, right? and I'll stop and I'll get out of the car and I'll be upset and I'll feel guilt because I killed some drunk guy or something, and I'll be upset. Why did that have to happen? And I'll blame myself for it. If only I had been driving slower or not been out driving at 2:30 a.m., why on earth would I be out driving at 2:30 a.m.? That just happened the other night, so that's a problem with me reading the paper and seeing all this bad news, right? It seems like since God created the whole universe, including all of time, even though I'm feeling like this was as a result of some choices that I made, God could have prevented it. God knows that this was good. This is part of what God already knows. It's already in his book, or her book, right, of everything. And so it seems like God is actually responsible for it. Why am I responsible? Why should I feel guilty for it? It was really God that did it. Well, I have free will, says Augustine. So I'm responsible for the choices I make. That doesn't stop me from thinking, but wait a minute, but God still knows what choices I'm going to make, right? So here's kind of the answer. Remember, Augustine doesn't really think he has the answers to all these hard questions, but one of them is to say that God allows us free choice because it makes our lives so much richer, knowing that we can make the right choices and then feel good about ourselves because we've made the right choices. As if everything we do was actually God's decision anyway, then I wouldn't feel any sense of self-worth for being the kind of good person I can make myself be. In other words, I would be just kind of like an automaton, a zombie,
Yeah.
if it wasn't for the fact that I'm making my own choices, and God allows us to make those choices, even if that means a lot of the times we're not going to make very good ones. But we have help. We have grace. God gives us grace, which enables... Am I out of time? It is. It's time for us to go. But so we have grace, which is a whole other thing. Where does the grace come from? And who gets it? Not everybody gets it. Well, that's not fair, etc. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little visit with St. Augustine. But we'll move on to kind of the followers of St. Augustine through the next 1,000 years or so, getting us ready for St. Thomas, not next week, but the week after that. Okay. Any questions? Thank you for coming, by the way. It's so much nicer actually talking to people. I don't know how well I would do if I ended up with nobody here.
Just in front of the camera.
I would be like, hi, please come to class so that I'm not here by myself.